Okay, no getting around it. This one's wicked. There are 85 general multiple choice questions, which tells you both how prominently the works from this unit featured on past AP exams, and also how many new questions I've been able to find. There are no matching questions. You've already had all of these on your quizzes. But there are a lot of questions about art historical periods or schools, which really start proliferating at the end of the 19th century. So I think reviewing the matching would still be a very good idea. So you should recognize the work on the left, since it's on the list. The tower, a model for the never-built monument to the Third International, was designed by Vladimir Tatlin. Russian constructivists set out to express the ideals of the Russian Revolution and to help, quote, construct, unquote, or build that revolution. But despite efforts such as the work on the left, Stalin distrusted the constructivists. They were too avant-garde, so the movement died out and was replaced by socialist realism. So what is the term for the kind of art we see on the left? That is, what medium does the artist employ? What was the artist's intended purpose in creating this work? So this is an accept question, and the painting gives one of the correct answers. Railroads made it much easier for artists to travel to the countryside to paint en plein air, that is, outside. What other changes made it easier for painters to travel light and to paint wherever they wanted? We talked about this. And a question about this painting, what is the artist trying to represent? By the way, the answer is almost always the same for Impressionist works, and a variation on this question has shown up on all sorts of past exams. So let me warn you about one incorrect choice. This architect did come up with the phrase form follows function, which would become a motto of international style architects such as Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, and Philip Johnson. But this architect was earlier, and he combined functional form with a love of decoration, so check out those doors. What kind of building is this? And here's a trickier question. Why did the architect decide to use steel coated in ceramic? Well, to answer that, think about where this building was constructed and what recent experience was on every architect's mind. It's, in fact, why this particular city needed so many new young architects like this one. And here's another big hint. This is another building designed by the same architect, the Prudential Building in Buffalo, New York. So what kind of building was this? What made it possible to construct this kind of building? And I'm talking not only about materials, but also changes in industrial production in general. In particular, what did the use of steel make possible? So I've included the floor plan from our required work by this architect as a big hint. Again, if you missed school on the day the class watched the architecture podcast, watch it on your own. These works are big College Board favorites, and students notoriously do poorly on architecture questions. So you have a chance to beat the odds. So I talked about this in my podcast. What limitations did New York City place on new skyscrapers, and how did this affect the design of the building on the right? It was also, by the way, influenced by the fact that there was a lovely old racket club that it didn't want to overshadow. How does the building on the left also take advantage of the site? What do these two buildings have in common? It's the same technological development, or one of them, that made this kind of building possible. Note that this question shows up in various forms throughout the unit. It's not a hard one to remember or get right. But this one is tricky because you will be tempted to answer lack of ornamentation or decorative features. In fact, this building did include some important decorative features, especially the bronze that was added to the window wall. It was not necessary structurally. So here's a quote from one analysis of the building. Quote, "At the time it was built, the Seagram building was the world's most costly skyscraper because of its use of expensive materials and lavish interior decorations, which included bronze, travertine, and marble throughout. The monolith cost $36 million to build and used 3.2 million pounds of bronze in its construction." So if lack of ornamentation or decorative features is not the answer, think of other characteristics of international style architecture. Remember, form follows function? These architects were all about showcasing a building structure, not trying to disguise it. So what's the most famous structural element of this building, and how was it created? The question really gives you an important clue. This interior photo should also give an important clue, and so should the Victorian floor plan on the right. That house, by the way, is a National Historical Site. It's the home of a female African-American civil rights leader from Richmond, Virginia. I talked about this in my podcast and showed you photos of the roof. And actually, this is an interesting question. The functions are very similar, right? There are also some common architectural features, although they may not strike you until you really stare at the two. The question does contain a vocabulary word that you need to know, and I don't think we've taught. Oops. What is a balustrade? Look it up. Do you see one on either building? On both? Your homework reading has the answer to the first question, and I think you heard about it in your presentations as well. The second question is tough, and I've given you the answer if you can attribute the painting on the left correctly. That is, both artists use geometrical forms to play games with depth perception and with multiple perspectives, very much a feature of modernist art. So the painting on the right in particular should give you a big clue. So I've just returned from 12 days in Mexico, and Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere. But how well known was she at the time she was painting? And I'm going to help you out with one wrong answer that might tempt you. Her work was, in fact, publicly shown in the U.S. during her lifetime. She had a solo show at a New York gallery when she was 31, but don't let that throw you off, okay? And here's a hint about the second question. Who was Frida Kahlo's husband, and what was he famous for? Did she try her hand at the same kind of painting? Did her husband's subject matter and style influence her work, whether she tried that kind of painting or not? What contextual feature of Frida Kahlo's life had the greatest influence on the work on the left? Basically, you need to know some of her very interesting biography. Okay, I thought this was a very hard question, but I included it anyway because it makes a point that may not have come out in class. Note that much of the painting is very bright, even cheerful. By the way, I was just in Oaxaca, Mexico at the beginning of Holy Week, and the balloon sellers thronged the Zocalo, or central square in front of the cathedral. But in this case, the brightness at the center is really in many ways artificial. It's hiding the rot of society, as that well-dressed skeleton might suggest. But note that when the artist is depicting past and potentially future conflicts, such as the arrival of Cortez on the left and the Indian family confronting the policeman on the right, his color palette becomes darker. This artist was painting in a time when Expressionist artists were using color to create an emotional reality, and the Mexican muralists are, in fact, sometimes classed as Expressionists. The second question is also tough, so more big hints. On the one hand, the painting is a dreamscape. These people did not all hang out together, and they did not hang out with skeletons. At the same time, the historical and contemporary figures are realistically depicted, and indeed they're clearly recognizable. So check out the self-portrait of the artist and the portrait of the artist's wife, our friend Frida Kahlo. You should recognize his style, and the characteristics of the style of the painter and the painter he's channeling are both from Spain. So who were these artists and what were they celebrating? I'm not looking for a specific name, but the aims of the entire movement. What kind of titles did Lawrence give to each work in his series? Where did this artist live and work? And what was their relationship to the political and cultural elite of their home city? The second question is easy. In fact, I think you already had a variation on the image-based test. So I talked about this in my podcast. What is the artist most famous for portraying? It shows up in this work as well. I've included a couple of huge hints. You remember what the work on the left is commemorating, right? That showed up in the earlier test review podcast. So pay attention both to the use of color and to the rather crude and geometric modeling of the forms. Also, what political message is this work sending? Is this artist an admirer of the military establishment? So these are technical terms you need to know. One refers to thickly applied paint, and it starts with an I. You've had it before. One is a term for opaque watercolor, and it starts with a G. At least up through this unit, we've only had one work that uses the second technique, and it's the work on the right. Where was each artist living when he painted his required work, and why was he living there? So both of these Mexican muralists explore themes of how Mexicans have been exploited by conquistadors, by American imperialists, and by their own leaders. By the way, I just saw lots more frescoes by both of them. Very interesting. So the work on the left is by Japanese woodblock artist Hiroshige. The work on the right is Van Gogh's copy of the same print. So one of our required works shows an especially strong Japanese woodblock print influence, and indeed it is itself another print. That one should be easy. But a harder accept question asks you to identify the formal influence of these prints on Impressionist and post-Impressionist painters. Now we've talked about how the use of flat planes of color influenced these artists. Note that these works, too, tended to focus on rural landscapes and that they often try to capture a scene by showing only part of it, as if the print was intended to spill out of its frame. Here's the actual image that goes with this question. You may recognize it from earlier tests. Okay, you all know who foisted the urinal in the art world, right? What was his intention in creating this work? That is the fountain. What did he call this whole category of work? And why is the fountain often named the most influential artwork of the 20th century? So one way of keeping the dates straight in this unit is to divide them into pre-World War I and post-World War I, that is the interwar years before World War II. Dada was one of the interwar movements. Expressionists painted before, during, and after World War I, but their works, and especially the works by the German Expressionists, were heavily influenced by the ominous build-up to and the tragic aftermath of the First World War. Actually, the tragic occurrences during the First World War. So the painting on the bottom right surely gives this one away. Look it up if you don't know. This is a question that I could really imagine showing up on the AP test. And I'm not going to give you the answer to this one since I think you'll be able to figure it out, and because I want you to stop and think about what your own answer would be. How do you respond to this work and why? So I don't know if the College Board will still ask about this movement since we don't have any required works, but the key word is speed, motion machine, and maybe, though not on this exam, the so-called cleansing power of war. In other words, Brock founded this school together with blank. This one should be easy. But to answer the second question, you need to know the two different categories of Cubism, confusingly both created by the same two artists. I talked about this in my podcast. These works are both examples from the school that does not use collages, and it's earlier. We don't have any required works from the second Cubist school, but you might need to know about it anyway. Here's perhaps his most famous work, along with White on White. This is a tough question in my view, so here's a big hint. Are these works symmetrical? I don't think so. They're balanced, but still asymmetrical. They are rectangular in design, and they employ primary colors, at least the painting and the furniture do. So I've given you everything but the except. Actually, there's some primary colors in the building now that I look at it more closely. So I've talked about Mondrian's rather odd spiritual views in my other test review podcast, but to get this question right, you need to remember the name of the religious or philosophical school that he belonged to. So I'm coupling our required Kandinsky work with a famous work by a post-World War II American artist who has, rather amazingly, dropped off the list, Jackson Pollock. So what is the opposite of representational? Another Kandinsky question. Like Mondrian, Kandinsky approached painting as a spiritual exercise. I mentioned his fascination with the Book of Revelation in my podcast, which will seem like a long time ago by now. According to the Book of Revelation, chaos will ensue just before a final redemption and eternal paradise is reestablished on earth. So Kandinsky was portraying chaos on the left side and a more ordered and elevated image on the right. But notice he's delivering the entire message abstractly. Personally, I'm not sure I see the right as that much more orderly than the left, but that's probably the inadequacy of my artistic eye. So this one's so easy, you may be wondering why I seem to be giving away the answer. But you need to think about why artists in Paris would be seeing so many works from Africa in the late 19th century. What was happening in Europe and Africa, and what brought these two different worlds together at this time. Impressionists were fascinated by the transitory effects of light, with capturing the moment. Cézanne was more interested in the basic, unchanging geometry of the world and uncovering its shapes and structures. He also departed from a long tradition of depicting visual space. And how did he depart from that? Finally, what later movement also focused on deconstructing geometric shapes, or deconstructing the world into geometric shapes? This painting is deceptively simple. Do not underestimate it. You're looking at a very important work in art history, and it's one you really ought to know thoroughly. I would not be at all surprised to see this appear as one of the multiple image-based question works on your AP exam. So what kind of juxtaposition is the artist playing with? Yup, the J word again. Think about what obsessed the Impressionists, we've talked about that a lot, and about how their paintings express this. You might also recall Renoir's despairing comments about Impressionism. So the first two answers are right there in the painting, though you need to know what you're looking for. I think the third answer is easy, but you should know the relationship between the two artists. Who was Wilfredo Lem's mentor? So the first question is an accept one, and a pretty easy one. It's a little hard to tell from the slides, but these works were both quite thickly painted, impasto, in very bright, vibrant colors. Also note the strong outlines, sometimes referred to as cloisonné outlines. Remember how you'd have metal around glass in works such as the migratory art. None of these shimmering, fading outlines that we see in Impressionist works. But what we do not see, what do we not see that we see in works, for example, by Cézanne, and even more, this is a big hint, Picasso and Braque? The second question is very tough. I had to look it up, but the College Board has asked it in the past, and you can find the answer in your readings on Fauvism, Expressionism, and Cubism. And in fact, it's on the same page as the painting on the right. So how did this artist end up painting Breton peasants and Polynesian girls? I think you'll find this one easy. You should also, however, be prepared for an attribution question about this artist. So here's an accept question, and I'm giving away the answer, but I'd love to have you pause the podcast and take a minute to try to see how all these influences show up in the work. And here's the kind of question that makes me nervous. What have we omitted that you'll need to know? The College Board dropped Vanitas paintings, although I showed you one. The theme of these paintings was that life was fleeting and death inevitable. Another term for this kind of painting is memento mori, M-E-M-E-N-T-O-M-O-R-I. Probably should have put the word up on the slide. That's Latin for the reminder of mortality or death. It was a popular theme in medieval and Renaissance art as well. You'll note the print there. Anyway, if you're watching this podcast now, you know the answer. Always watch out for that word formal. Remember that it refers to style. So here's a big hint. This is what the Metropolitan Museum of Art has to say about the photo on the left, which is also a photograph by Stieglitz. Stieglitz introduced Picasso's work to America in 1911. In the winter of 1915, he mounted an exhibition of drawings and paintings by Picasso, this time adding the work of Braque and archaic Mexican pottery and carvings. That's what you're seeing here. The structure of the picture, like its subject, conveys Stieglitz's belief that the future of modern art, including photography, lay in abstraction, although he was very much a realist himself. But you're seeing an emphasis on what? So what might both photographs have in common with Cubism? If you think about it, I think you'll find it easy to choose the right answer. One more hint. The passengers in steerage were being returned to Europe. They weren't coming to America. They were going home. They'd been rejected at Ellis Island. To me, this increases the emotional impact of the work. Okay, last one. And here's a hint for the first question. It's the same device that tends to be used a couple of decades later by expressionists such as the Fauves, the Blue Rider School, and the Bridge. And what was spooky about the neighborhood? I talked about this in my podcast, although I only mentioned the insane asylum. I missed the slaughterhouse. Apparently one could hear both human and animal screams from this bridge. Anyway, good luck. Only one more unit to go.